My name's Eric Buth. I work at the New York Times. I work specifically in the interactive news department. Recently on my job, I had to go to orientation, which sounds strange to me because I've been there for almost 2 years. But they do a second orientation for some reason, where they have all the various heads of desks and things come in and sort of give you a short talk about what it is they do. And I was kind of interested to hear the one from my own department, as it is that I seemingly struggle to answer the question, what do we do in interactive news? I'll say that I've even failed at answering that question at least once this morning, which is probably bad because it's important to the substance of the presentation. But so I'll do what one of my bosses did during that meeting, which is just show you a couple of the things that we're nominally responsible for. If I can make this work, sorry. Oops. All right. So this is the Guantanamo docket. And what this is basically is a accounting for of all the detainees that have been held and are currently held in Guantanamo and what has happened to them over the years. It's a pretty thorough project. You can play through it, sort of see the balance over time. There's information on individuals. The internet is cooperating along with basically like every document that's ever been collected about them. It's a pretty cool resource. There are such features as Watching Syria's War, which is more or less a continuous feature on our site relating to individual news items going on in Syria. So this is still updated, but it'll be things like an individual video clip as we get them with some information. And this is sort of short of being a full article. It is to just be more current and show more of the material. We also do things like the Olympics, for instance. So we manage collecting data feeds for various set events, including elections, but also sporting events, such as the Olympics, which is actually a huge event with numerous problems, but that's something else we do. We also have people in our department working on things like generating haikus. This is a really cool project. These are accidental haikus in the New York Times, and if you haven't seen it, it's pretty great. It's just an algorithm going through and picking out. Yeah, they're pretty awesome. They're pretty awesome. It's not the full fire hose of said accidental haikus. They are like somebody does put human eyeballs on them at some point, but they're pretty great. Another poetry piece we did, because it was actually just Poetry Month, is this blackout poetry piece where users can come and take articles and sort of craft individual poems based on the idea that as if you were sitting in front of it, blacking out with a marker. And I'll leave it there. There are a great many other things, but if you guess what is in common with all those projects, you are doing better than I am, because I don't know either. So I think that there is one thing in common with all those projects that doesn't actually have to do with their content, and that is that we've sort of ended up responsible for the things that we say yes to doing, which is pretty good. It's good and bad, but I thought another way that I could explain the way this works is I would just show the building that we work in. I work in the newsroom in a news department, and all of that stuff is in this little building behind that big building. And this is significant for a couple of ways, but one is that a lot of the architecture is separated between the newsroom and what I sort of think of as big New York Times. In this case, literally large New York Times. Although we only occupy half of that building, I should say, but it's still a lot. Over time, this process of saying yes to various projects has meant that within the newsroom, our department has begun to grow its own infrastructure systems. And this is really awesome in some ways, but a big hassle in other ways. One of the ways that it's a hassle is it's sort of my responsibility to manage the system. But there's also, in addition to that, there are these larger, sort of more corporate departments, if that's something I can say, that manage things like the CMS, things like the iPhone app, more or less anything that could be construed as a typical software project or something that has long-term goals and milestones and releases in a very sort of traditional fashion. And down in the newsroom, what we sort of end up with is absolutely everything else. So if it was too complicated or too idiosyncratic or too short-lived or you needed it on too short notice, those are the things that we end up with, which is a much smaller subset of the totality of the things that the Times does, but it is a deeply heterogeneous subset of those things. These are applications that are coming from collaborations with different departments. They could be dropped on us all together. The example that I was going to give, so you all may have seen this dialect quiz on the internet, for instance. This wasn't a project out of our department, but it came up on very short notice, I'd say the week before Christmas, and definitely ended up being a project that we ended up hosting. So what was brought to my attention about 2 days before it was going to go up turned out to do more traffic than all of the other individual article pages of the New York Times combined last year, which was a little bit of a problem. Definitely involved some doing. It was more or less someone from graphics came to my desk and said, "Hey, can you run this Note app?" And that's a pretty good example of the way things go. Which is okay. Get back to the thing here. So there are good reasons for that kind of stuff, right? I mean, there's in the newsroom there's a lot of urgency. That's not necessarily the best example tied to the news, but there are things that are tied to the news, and if you don't do them and you don't do them right then, you haven't done them. You've sort of permanently not done them, and that moment is gone. So now you don't have that. And that's a pretty good argument for almost always trying to do a thing when you can. And over time, if you work in media for a long while, this can end up to some resentment, especially if you work in systems. You're typically working on a very small team. A lot of media organizations don't even have DevOps teams, which is pretty common. It's kind of an afterthought for a lot of small companies. But what can happen to you is that time and time again, someone will sort of tell you that this is the most important thing that's ever happened and it's gotta go out. And you sort of realize and feel like you're accumulating this massive things that you're responsible for and that there's no end in sight. And you kind of start to get mean about it. I think this probably happens to anybody who works in ops, but I feel like it especially happens in media, is that over time, if you are running any particular part of the show and you can say no, you start to say no almost all the time. We're a Ruby shop, we don't do that. Or, we really need everybody to use MySQL because that goes in an RDS and that's it. That's what we can handle, that's what we do, there are reasons for that. And I'd say about a year ago, I attempted to consciously change my tune about this, mostly because of realizing that I was on the road to becoming a terribly bitter jerk. And what I think the heart of that is that it's just the opposite. And be like, what if your relationship with these people in the newsroom, these people that are bringing you projects, is that you were trying to say yes. And this goes back to what I sort of gather is I feel like the reason to be of our department, and it's saying yes to the random things at the right times. And it's a pain in the ass, but it's nice. And there's a lot of reasons for that beyond just not being a terribly bitter person. I think one of the things is that if you have flexibility and there are things that people are enthusiastic about and you shut them down, it's not good for you and it's not good for them, and they resent you too. Over enough time, and you've really missed an opportunity. A lot of people have hobbies. A lot of people are in tech because they're very enthusiastic about it, and from my point of view, actively wasting their enthusiasm is a pretty bad thing to do. It's probably the worst thing you can do. And this sounds like management strategy. I'm not a manager in any sort of way, but I think that when you do ops stuff, you sort of wield a vaguely managerial power in the sense that you're being tasked to lead technology projects. And by lead, I mean, you're shaping them with your advice. You're lending a hand, you're helping organize it. But if you've been in a bad spot for a long time, a lot of what that ends up is you just telling people no until you get them to do exactly what you want. And that's, so I think that's something that I'm trying to bring to this right now is maybe empathy was a theme earlier today, and it's sort of empathy-driven DevOps where, you're taking people's concerns seriously, but you're also keeping in mind that you sort of have your hopes and dreams in your hand, and if you crush those, they're not going to do their best work, or they're not going to be able to do things as fast. We have people who are interested in Haskell. We have people that are interested in doing things with, Remon and Clojure and things like that. And if you don't let them bring that into their work, then their work is just going to be the hobby they have while they're really working on all this other stuff. And you should bring the parts of their work that they're more interested into the fold. So when you're in this crazy universe where you've got a million different heterogeneous applications, it's kind of difficult to mandate a certain way of doing things. And that can be as simple as things like technology selection. Be like, please don't use Apache for this, like use Nginx. We have a configuration set up for that, things like that. That can be very difficult, but at the individual application level, it becomes the real Wild West. Are you even logging? What are you logging? How would I go about collecting that? Can you set it up without telling me? Those are all questions that become really important. So in the end, it seems to me that for us, everything that works in our universe is almost completely self-serve. And for things like metrics gathering, that basically means they have to be zero configuration systems. It would be incredibly challenging for me to get people to agree on, the boilerplate metrics for individual applications or things like that. So we just sort of don't. And what we do instead comes out of this cut between literally dictating to someone what things they should use. Be like, here's your Rails boilerplate. Here's how it plugs into Unicorn or something, and here's how we serve it out with Nginx. What we're trying to move towards is suggesting you should come up with something. It would be awesome if you were reasonable in these particular ways, but other than that, we'll work with you. And this is sort of just a quick story about how that applies to our metrics gathering. So the big board problem, this is a problem that every media organization has. Like everybody wishes or does have, some big monitor in their office where they've got what's performing really well, the sort of like Chartbeat-esque, what's up, what's down, are we 500ing in places, what pages are 500ing, what's loading slow, things like that. And when I got to the Times, there was a system in place that was gathering logs over time and processing them, doing just Apache logs, doing aggregation, which very quickly got to be a little bit of a problem given that nobody was managing this for them at all. Especially right off the bat because we use a lot of Varnish. So this is another thing when you're kind of dealing with the Wild West of apps. Being able to very aggressively cache things is pretty key. But we would lose those hits. Varnish, for instance, doesn't really log. I mean, you can make it log, but you're basically going to drain performance out of it because it's writing to disk every time. So if you have a very fast memory cache that you're using to serve 99% of the hits against your website, trying to adapt that to a log rolling statistic aggregation method was it's not that it's impossible, it was going to be work for us. We'd have to fake it somehow. So that's where we started looking at things like StatsG, and I'm sure people are familiar with StatsG. I like it a lot. It really kind of blew my mind when it came out because it sort of fits it fits this awesome personal paradigm of we don't get anything that we're not asking for. And we can accommodate asks, but we sort of don't spend time doing a lot of work that we don't need to, which is awesome. So if you want to instrument your application, you can do that without asking anybody. If you want to check your load times, you can do that without asking anybody. And What was great about it is that there's a lot of off-the-shelf tools. It's using UDP messaging, so it's easy to integrate into things like Varnish. It's easy to integrate into any particular app. So it really fit the bill for us. And what I especially loved about it is that it's not a particularly overdone solution. Like, it's very simple. It's dead simple. It's easy to explain, and it's easy in function. So, speaking of not oversolving the problem, we pretty promptly decided to oversolve the problem. Beginning with a few imagined what could we do with something that worked this way. And in this, still in this mode of going towards something that is completely self-serve, there were a couple of things. We wanted to make it slightly easier to run, and by that I kind of mean we wanted to not manage having to run a node application or run any of its supporting applications. We wanted it to sort of be one individual thing that our developers could use as a service, more or less. Another target of mine is that I wanted to eliminate the flushing in the app. So we didn't really want to have to think about storing this data at various points or pulling out large chunks of it out of like a Mongo database and culling the useful pieces of it. We more or less needed something that would expire on a window. And on top of all that, we basically needed it to have a JSON API because that is a important lingua franca in our office and works really well. So trying to move faster. Go was a good choice. I'm a big proponent of using Go, and one of the big reasons is not that it's fast, yes, it is fast, but the biggest thing is that it's really nice to work with binaries. It's less nice in an application context, mostly because releasing it is more complicated. Are you going to do builds for different architectures, things like that? That's a question that most app developers don't want and don't need to worry about. But if you're doing things like building a daemon that needs to run on every host machine, for instance, it's really nice. You don't really add a lot of extraneous things to the system. You don't, and you don't risk having to monitor yet another interpreter that may also fail. And you also get really nice synchronization just when you want it for free. I mean, the sync library is great. It just gives you all the nuts and bolts of mutexes and whatnot that you need to get anything synchronized on in a way that's actually more complicated than it needs to be in other languages. I really like Redis. This sounded like a Redis problem. The gist of it is that the stats collection mostly seemed like set management, ordered sets of objects, maintaining unique sets of strings or things like that. So it seemed really nice. What if I could tie it really close to Redis? So I went with that. And the key thing about Redis for me was the data expiry. So it was this kind of very easy way to get this data to get flushed out, which is more or less perfect. So we don't need to worry about what we're collecting at any point because we're dumping all of it. We set the window. We can tell people that things are available on these time frames for this long, and that's it. Lua. So Redis enabled server-side scripting a while ago. This is one of the things where I have to be like, oh, we're picking something that I was enthusiastic about too. I'm in the position to select technology, so I'm going to pick the things that I think are exciting, and I wanted to do something with this. So I thought I'd give it a try. This isn't actually going to be, oh, we made all these smart decisions and then we ended up with something awesome. So keep that in mind. The idea would be that, if we're not saving all this data anyway, why do we ever pull it out of the database? Why don't we leave it all there and we can do the statistics in real time on the database? And this is just out there because I think it's awesome. It's just the little piece of Lua that we use for this, and it doesn't insert into a sorted set. It gets your 90th percentile. It gets your average. Sets those all into one key that persists slightly longer than the entire set of data. There's some awesome magic in here, like for some reason Ziad and Redis can be done in a login time, which I don't know how that's possible. Because it seems to suggest you can sort it faster than you should be able to, given that it's basically insertion sort. But that's a whole other thing. But it's about how this is interesting and compelling, and was a real driver for this project, that there was just something compelling to do. And what we ended up with was this. So what this is just consuming JSON from the back end, and is a simple real-time chart that you can go down to 10 seconds and see the data flow in. You can see things coming from Varnish. We've got other things doing metrics across individual servers, but this was just a boilerplate that I set up. The real idea was that it was going to be very important for individual developers to be able to build one of these for their project, for whatever metric they were looking for. And that more or less happened. So the Olympics is a great example where somebody just took this, built up a very stringent set of metrics and monitoring for a very complicated consumer setup. Consuming data from the Olympics is awful. It comes in this terrible format. You've got to get the message once or you're screwed, and it's needed to be very carefully watched. But another team was able to, pretty much without my involvement, set up their own metric system that actually scaled to about 10 times our base traffic pretty easily just using an instance of this. So it was successful even if it was ill thought out, potentially unnecessary, and driven mostly by things that I wanted to do. But so it had some problems. UDP is a wonderful but difficult thing to work with sometimes. I mean, the gist is that you get to send a message for free, but you don't know if it gets there, right? So where this really rears its ugly head is if something isn't scaling right and you're filling up the buffer on a machine or in your app, you won't necessarily know that you're losing packets all over the place. You saw that to some degree in StatsG by sampling, but it's difficult. It's always there with UDP. Redis was another bit of an issue in that it's a little bit difficult to scale horizontally. That's becoming easier, but we hit some pain points with that. Moving on. Okay. Yes. So probably don't do that, and it's not that we wasted time. So this is going to be an incredibly mixed message, but rolling your own is kind of great, and this isn't like a cautionary tale about rolling your own. It's kind of saying, if you feel like it and it's interesting enough and you have the time to do it, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, it is a pretty interesting way to get to the bottom of what your actual requirements are. In this case, we're realizing that we didn't know until we got to the end that actually the key feature of any of this is that developers be able to build their own interfaces to the data. And so I'll wrap it up. I want to show you one other thing, but please feel free to get in touch with me. So there is the sort of future of things that we are working on in conjunction with some other people in the R&D department, which is yet another disparate tech department at the New York Times. They've worked on this tool called Stream Tools. We've contributed it some by actually adding a UDP consumer for it, but the gist of this tool is it actually it assumes that all of your data inputs are coming in streams of JSON, and gives you quick tools to sort of build summaries and interfaces for that information. This animated GIF is not doing it full justice, and I really should have done a better demo than this, but you should check this out. Just look up Stream Tools, MIT Labs. It's pretty awesome stuff. But that's sort of where we're going with everything, where we're sort of actually going back to using the log-based information and turning those logs into subscribable streams. And that's the mysterious, confusing point that I'll end it on. But thank you. Oh, sure. If anybody has any questions. It's really bright up here.
So once you define the streams with stream tools, does it generate that, does it do something else with that representation?
Yeah, you can tell it to do a lot of different things. You can tell it. Oh, sorry. He was asking about the MIT Labs Stream Tools project, and once you consume the data, if I'm getting this right, what do you do with it? Can you output it? Things like that. And the answer is, you can do any number of things. They're working on new things all the time, but there are different blocks, such as saving out to Redis, simply logging to the console, re-reporting it to somewhere else. The idea would be that you would be able to, in real time, also select essentially the back end of it and where it goes. Anybody else?